So, is God against sex? Well, before we can even really begin to answer that question, we first need to establish which God are we talking about. Are we referring to the God of the Bible or to one of the many other countless deities that people have worshipped down through the ages? Because when you look at the history of religion, many of the god and goddesses that people have worshipped apart from the Bible have certainly been portrayed as liking their sex. In fact, the worship of these deities often involve religious ceremonies requiring people to have sex with each other. And we're just not talking about ordinary sex here. No, we're talking about the kind that would make even 50 Shades of Grey look normal. Now, as appealing as all that may sound, I'd like to think that by the end of this video, you'll have a new appreciation for what the God of the Bible has to say about sex. In the book of Leviticus, found in the Old Testament of the Bible, there's a long list of sexual practices that the ancient Israelites were forbidden from doing, such as not having sex with your mother, your aunties, your sisters, your daughter-in-laws, your own daughters, your granddaughters, and even with animals. Why in heaven's name would the Israelites even need to be told not to do those things? Well, the writer of Leviticus goes on to explain that it was because those were the sexual norms of the culture surrounding Israel. In other words, everyone was doing it. Even in our own sex-crazed culture, it's difficult for us to comprehend the scale in which sex affected every aspect of ancient life, especially religion. Take a look at just about any ancient religion, and you'll see gods having sex with each other, with humans, and yes, even with animals. Now, bearing that in mind, the God of the Israelites was radically different. Unlike some of the other creation stories of the nations surrounding Israel, the Genesis version doesn't have the Almighty raping a goddess who then gives birth to the moon. And it's also important to note that both Adam and Eve were naked. Now, to you and I, that may seem rather strange, but to an ancient reader, it would have been very significant. For when God would meet them every day in the garden, he just wanted friendship, not sex. Now, what you have to understand is that this was a radically new way to look at both sexuality and spirituality. Unlike the deities of the other cultures, the worship of the God of the Israelites didn't revolve around unrestrained sex. Rather, quite the opposite. What pleased this deity was a man who remained faithful to his wife. Now, what made this view of sexuality so unique is that it was essentially the first time in the ancient world when sex became civilized. Men simply couldn't go around and expect to have sex with whomever they pleased. Now, this radically countercultural view of monogamy was later adopted by Christianity. Ancient Roman life was, how would you say, a pervert's paradise. Fidelity was seen as unmanly, and it was perfectly acceptable for a married man to have many lovers on the side of either gender. Yet, like the Israelites, the Christians were not to live that way. Sex was only reserved for marriage. Now, certainly, few things are more repulsive to the Western mind than the sexual abuse of children. And so it would only be natural for us to assume that, well, the rest of humanity has always felt this way as well. And yet, tragically, the opposite has usually been the case. Throughout much of human history, the sexual exploitation of children has been culturally acceptable, especially men with boys. To cite just one of many examples of how casual the ancients viewed the practice, take the worn cup. It's a Roman goblet depicting a man molesting a boy. Imagine being at a dinner party and having your drink served in something like that. Cheers? So why? Why do we in the Western world now view such behavior as morally evil? Well, you can thank those early Christians for imposing their views of sexuality upon the rest of society. Because of the influence of Christianity, the sexual exploitation of children was eventually outlawed throughout the Roman Empire, along with other culturally acceptable practices such as the gladiator fights, slavery, and infanticide. Now, I come from an agricultural background, and I know how important pesticides are. So I really don't understand this whole organic craze and how organic farming is being treated as this new leap forward for humanity. Because prior to the invention of pesticides, all food was grown organically, and that's why millions of people starved to death. Now, I see this as analogous to our own Judeo-Christian heritage. Our culture sees its restraints and safeguards around sexuality much like they do pesticides. something that is dangerous and unhealthy. What's more, like organic farming, many assume that living without these restraints is somehow a new great leap forward for humanity. Yet as I hope to have shown in this video, there's nothing progressive about it, because people have been living without those restraints throughout most of human history, and as a result, women and children have suffered. A man by the name of G.K. Chesterton once wrote that before you tear down a fence, you better ask why it was even built in the first place. And in my own lifetime, I've seen our culture celebrate the tearing down of just about every single fence that our Judeo-Christian heritage has built around sexuality without any consideration as to why. Why were those fences even built? So now there really is only one fence remaining, the one protecting our children from sexual predation. Yet I fully expect to see that fence torn down in my own lifetime as well. You think I'm crazy? Well, just remember that the sexual exploitation of minors has largely been the norm, not the exception throughout history. Because that's what happens when all sexual restraints are taken out of the way. Everyone becomes fair game, including children. Well, not exactly the most uplifting YouTube video out there, but I do believe it needed to be said. And if you think likewise, then please show your support by clicking on the share button. Now, if this is the very first video that you've ever watched of mine, I'm sure that you've picked up by now that I do tend to cover topics that are just a little bit off the mainstream. Next month, I'm going to be attempting to tackle the age-old question, why does God allow evil and suffering? So if these sort of topics appeal to you, then please click on the subscribe button. Thanks for watching, and keep searching.